The silence in our house isn't the peaceful kind you find in a library. It's a heavy, suffocating shroud that feels like it's made of lead. My name is Elena, I'm 32, and I've spent the last few years becoming a stranger to the man I once thought was my soulmate. Radin is a brilliant architect, a man who builds towering skyscrapers of glass and steel, but he hasn't noticed that the foundation of our marriage has turned into shifting sand. We live in this pristine, high-end mansion where every surface is cold marble and every room is a gallery of expensive, soulless art. He's always buried in his blueprints, his eyes fixed on some distant horizon while I'm standing right in front of him, slowly turning into a ghost. That night, the sky looked like a bruised, purple wound, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and coming thunder. I couldn't stay inside those suffocating walls for one more second, watching him drink his expensive whiskey in total silence. I walked out into the dark, heading toward the edge of our property where the manicured lawn gives way to a jagged, abandoned construction site. The wind was whipping my hair across my face like a lash when I heard it, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a wet, rattling groan, a sound of pure agony coming from the depths of the earth. I grabbed my phone, clicked on the flashlight, and crept toward a massive, muddy trench that had been dug for a foundation that was never poured. When the beam hit the bottom, my heart stopped. Down there, half buried in freezing black sludge and rusted rebar, was a small, white pony. She was so emaciated that her ribs looked like a row of knives under her skin, and her legs were twisted at an impossible angle. She looked up at me with eyes so full of ancient, hollow despair that I felt a physical pain in my chest. In that moment, I didn't see an animal. I saw a reflection of my own life, trapped, broken, and being swallowed by a darkness that no one else cared to see. I knew if I didn't act, the mud would fill her lungs by dawn, and the thought of her dying alone in that hole felt like a death sentence for my own soul. I dialed Radin's number with fingers that were slick with cold rain and shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. I expected him to be annoyed, to give me that clipped, professional tone he used when I interrupted his important work, but when I screamed into the receiver about the dying creature in the pit, something in his voice cracked. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, a flicker of the man who used to stay up all night helping me through my darkest moments. 30 minutes later, the roar of his SUV cut through the storm, the headlights slicing the darkness like a serrated blade. He jumped out of the car, and for once, he didn't care about his $1,000 suit or his polished leather shoes. He ran to the edge of the trench, and when he saw the pony, his face went deathly pale. The sight of something so innocent being crushed by such a brutal, uncaring environment seemed to shatter the icy wall he'd built around himself. We didn't talk about our fight from earlier or the months of cold shoulders and bitter words. We just moved. Radin sprinted back to his truck and pulled out heavy-duty ropes and a portable floodlight he kept for site visits. As the harsh white light filled the hole, the horror became even more vivid. The pony's back leg was hooked on a jagged piece of rusted metal, and every time she struggled, the water around her turned a darker shade of crimson. "Elena, I have to go down there," he said, his voice raw and urgent. He tied a rope around a concrete pillar and lowered himself into the freezing muck. I watched him sink up to his waist, his hands reaching out to steady the terrified animal. For the first time in an eternity, we weren't two strangers living in a hollow house. We were a team fighting against the encroaching shadow. I stood at the edge, my muscles screaming as I held the rope, watching my husband disappear into the mud to save a life that the rest of the world had discarded. It felt like we were digging our way out of our own grave, one handful of filth at a time. The rescue was a nightmare of straining muscles and the sickening sound of metal grinding against bone. Radin had to use a hacksaw to cut through the rebar that was pinning the pony's leg, and every vibration made the poor creature let out a high-pitched, whistling scream that I'll hear in my dreams for the rest of my life. The rain turned into a torrential downpour, threatening to wash the mud down into the trench and bury them both alive. I was leaning over the edge, my hands raw and bleeding from the friction of the rope, shouting encouragement that felt like a lie in the face of so much darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours of agonizing labor, Radin managed to loop a harness around her chest. "Now, Elena, pull," he roared, his voice barely audible over the thunder. I threw my entire weight into the rope, my heels digging into the slick earth, feeling the terrifying resistance of the mud trying to keep its prize. Inch by inch, we hauled her up. When she finally rolled onto the grass, she looked less like a horse and more like a pile of wet, gray rags. She wasn't moving. Radin climbed out of the hole, his face a mask of black sludge and exhaustion, and collapsed next to her. We both hovered over her, our breath coming in ragged gasps, waiting for a sign of life. Just when I thought she was gone, her chest gave a weak, shuddering heave, and a spray of muddy water erupted from her nostrils. She was alive, but she was broken. Radin reached out and touched my hand, not the polite, cold touch of a husband performing a duty, but a desperate, clinging grip. We sat there in the mud, two people who had forgotten how to love each other, bound together by the survival of a creature that had no business being alive. We decided right then, without saying a word, that we wouldn't let her go. We would take her to the old, neglected stable at the back of our estate, a place that, much like our marriage, had been built for a future we never bothered to inhabit. We moved the pony, whom I named Hope, into the stable under the flickering light of a battery-powered lantern. The smell of old hay and damp would fill the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, jasmine-scented rooms of our mansion. Radin didn't head straight for the shower. He stayed in the straw, his hands working tirelessly to clean the deep gashes on Hope's flanks. I watched him, mesmerized by the focus in his eyes. This wasn't the man who spent his days arguing over building codes and profit margins. This was someone raw and real. We spent the entire night there, taking turns rubbing her trembling body with warm towels and whispering words of comfort that we probably needed as much as she did. The storm outside raged on, but inside the stable, a different kind of energy was brewing. For the first time in years, the ocean of resentment between us seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a shared mission that felt more important than any of our petty grievances. We talked in low voices, not about the bills or the social events we were dreading, but about the miracle of her heartbeat. Radin confessed that he had felt like he was drowning for a long time, suffocated by the pressure of being perfect, and that seeing Hope in that hole made him realize how close he was to losing his own soul. I listened, my heart aching with a mixture of sadness and relief. We were two broken people trying to fix a broken animal, and in the process, the cracks in our own foundation were beginning to show. It was a terrifying realization, but for the first time, it didn't feel like the end of the world. It felt like a beginning. The following days were a blur of vet visits, expensive medications, and a constant, underlying fear that Hope wouldn't make it through the night. Her injuries were extensive, the rusted metal had sliced through muscle and nicked a bone, and the infection was aggressive. But Radin was relentless. He built a custom sling in the stable, using his engineering knowledge to create a system that would take the weight off her injured leg while still allowing her to stand. He stayed up until 3 a.m. every night, adjusting the pulleys and checking her temperature. I focused on her nutrition, making special mashes of oats and molasses, trying to coax some life back into her hollow frame. Our house became a ghost town. We only went back to eat or sleep for a few hours. The neighbors probably thought we'd lost our minds, but for us, the stable was the only place that felt honest. One afternoon, as I was brushing the dried mud out of her mane, Hope leaned her head against my shoulder and let out a deep, rattling sigh. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated trust that brought tears to my eyes. Radin was standing in the doorway, watching us, and for the first time in a decade, I saw a genuine smile on his face. He walked over and put his arm around my waist, pulling me close. "We're doing it, Elena," he whispered. She's fighting because she knows we're here. The warmth of his body against mine felt like a shock to the system, a reminder of a physical connection I'd almost forgotten existed. As Hope's physical wounds began to heal, the emotional scars of our marriage became more apparent. One evening, while we were sitting in the straw after a long day of physical therapy with her, a simple question about the household budget spiraled into a bitter argument. All the old baggage came rushing back, his long hours, my feelings of abandonment, the way we used to hurt each other with silence. It was like the storm had moved inside the stable. You only care about this because it's a project, Radin. I snapped, my voice echoing off the wooden beams. Once she's healed, you'll go right back to your skyscrapers and leave me alone in that big, empty house. He stood up, his face flushed with anger, but then he looked down at Hope. She was watching us, her ears pricked back, her eyes wide with that familiar fear. He stopped mid-sentence, the rage draining out of him as quickly as it had come. He realized, as I did, that our toxicity was poisoning the very thing we were trying to save. He sat back down, his head in his hands. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've been using my work as a shield because I didn't know how to handle the fact that I was failing you. I was so afraid of being an unsuccessful husband that I just stopped trying to be one at all." The honesty in his voice was like a physical blow. I sat down next to him, the smell of hay and horse filling my senses, and for the first time, we didn't walk away. We stayed in the mess. The rehabilitation of Hope's leg was slow and agonizingly painful for her. Every time she tried to put weight on it, she would let out a soft, whistling groan that made me want to give up on her behalf. But Radin wouldn't let me. He became her physical therapist, guided by his knowledge of structural loads and balance. He spent hours walking beside her, supporting her with the sling, whispering encouragement into her velvet ears. I noticed a change in him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady patience. He started taking calls from his office less and less, delegating tasks he used to micromanage with a death grip. He was finally choosing us over the glass towers. One Saturday, we were out in the paddock, trying to get Hope to take her first steps without the sling. The air was crisp and smelled of autumn. She took one shaky step, her leg trembling violently, then another. I was holding my breath, my hands clenched at my chest. Then she stumbled. I gasped, ready to run to her, but Radin caught her, his strong arms acting as a temporary brace. He didn't pull her back. He just held her steady until she found her footing again. "You can do it, girl," he urged. She looked at him, then at me, and with a sudden burst of energy, she took 3 strong, steady steps toward the fence. We erupted in cheers, hugging each other and the horse in a chaotic, joyful mess. It was a tiny victory, but it felt like we'd conquered Everest. As Hope's strength grew, our house started to feel different too. We stopped caring if the floors were perfectly polished or if the expensive art was perfectly aligned. We started bringing the life of the stable into the mansion, boots left by the door, the scent of hay lingering in the hallway, and most importantly, the sound of laughter. We started cooking together again, making simple meals instead of ordering gourmet delivery. One night, while we were making pasta, Radin told me about a dream he'd had. He wanted to use his architecture firm to design low-cost, sustainable animal shelters and community centers. He wanted his work to have a heart. "I realized I don't want to build monuments to ego anymore," he said, tossing the salad. "I want to build things that matter, like what we did for her." I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I saw a future that didn't feel like a prison sentence. I saw a man who had been humbled by a creature that had nothing but a will to survive. We weren't the power couple people envied anymore. We were something much better. We were a work in progress. But the darkness wasn't entirely gone. There were still nights when the old shadows would crawl back, when a misunderstood word would lead to a cold shoulder, but now we had a reason to fight through it. We had hope. The anniversary of the night we found Hope was approaching, and the atmosphere was bittersweet. She was almost fully recovered, her coat thick and glossy, her spirit vibrant and playful. But we knew that our bubble was about to burst. The vet had cleared her for more intense activity, and it was time to decide her future. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch watching her graze in the moonlight, Radin took my hand. "Elena, I've been thinking about what happens next. Not just for her, but for us." I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Was he going to go back to the old ways? "I want to turn the back half of our estate into a permanent sanctuary," he continued, his voice steady and full of conviction. "Not just for horses, but for any animal that's been discarded. And I want us to run it together." I was speechless. He was proposing a complete life change, a total departure from the prestige and the profit he had spent his life chasing. "I realized that the most important thing I ever built was the bridge back to you," he added, looking me in the eyes. "And Hope was the one who showed me the way." I leaned into him, the coldness of the night air forgotten in the warmth of his embrace. We had survived the storm, saved a life, and in the process, found a way to save our own. The transition to the sanctuary was chaotic and exhausting. We had to deal with permits, zoning laws, and a sudden influx of animals that needed immediate care. But instead of being a source of stress, it became our new language. We worked side by side, building fences, clearing brush, and designing enclosures that were as beautiful as they were functional. Radin was in his element, using his skills to create a space that felt like a paradise for the broken. I took charge of the logistics, the fundraising, and the daily care of our growing family of rescues. Our marriage was no longer a series of polite transactions. It was a gritty, high-stakes partnership. We fought, sure, but the fights were about how to help a scared dog or where to place a new barn, not about the emptiness of our lives. One afternoon, while we were installing a new water trough, I looked at Radin. He was covered in dirt, his hair messy, and he was laughing at a goat that was trying to eat his blueprints. He looked younger, happier, and more alive than I had ever seen him. I realized then that the success we had been chasing was a lie. This was the real success, the ability to look at something broken and see the potential for beauty. Hope was the undisputed queen of the sanctuary. She seemed to know that she was the reason for all of it. She would greet every new arrival with a gentle nuzzle, acting as a calm presence for animals that arrived terrified and broken. She was particularly drawn to a young girl from a nearby foster home who came to volunteer. The girl was silent, her eyes full of the same hollow despair I had seen in Hope that first night. I watched from the fence as Hope approached her, lowering her head and letting the girl touch her velvet nose. It was a moment of profound, wordless connection that broke my heart and healed it all at once. Radin was standing next to me, his arm around my shoulder. "That's why we do it, isn't it?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. We had created a ripple effect of healing that was reaching far beyond the walls of our stable. Our marriage was no longer just about us. It was about the life we were fostering in everyone and everything around us. The silence in our house was gone, replaced by the symphony of a sanctuary, barking, whinnying, and the constant, rhythmic sound of life being rebuilt. As the years went by, the sanctuary grew into a well-known institution. Radin's firm became a leader in ethical architecture, and I found a calling I never knew I had. We were busy, tired, and often overwhelmed, but we were never again alone. The darkness that had once threatened to swallow us was kept at bay by the light of the lives we were saving. One evening, as we were celebrating Hope's 10th anniversary of her rescue, Radin and I walked out to the original trench. It had been filled in and covered with a beautiful garden of wildflowers. A small stone plaque marked the spot where Hope found us. We stood there in the quiet, the air smelling of lavender and damp earth. I used to be so afraid of this place, I admitted, looking at the vibrant flowers. I thought it was where our marriage went to die. Radin squeezed my hand. It was where our old life died, Elena. But it was also where the real one began. We looked at each other, The years of struggle and growth etched in the lines around our eyes, and I knew that no matter what storms came our way, we were ready. We had learned that a foundation isn't built once. It's maintained every single day with patience, honesty, and a lot of love. But life has a way of testing your resolve when you least expect it. A few months later, a massive wildfire swept through the hills near our property. The sky turned an apocalyptic orange and the air became thick with choking ash. We had to evacuate dozens of animals in a matter of hours. The stress was unimaginable. Old patterns of behavior started to resurface: Radin's tendency to shut down and bark orders, my tendency to panic and feel unsupported. For a moment, in the heat of the chaos, it felt like we were back in the mansion, two strangers fighting for control. "I told you we needed a better evacuation plan, Radin," I shouted over the roar of the wind as we loaded the last of the horses into the trailers. He didn't answer, his face a mask of soot and determination. I felt that old, cold knot of resentment tightening in my chest. Was this it? Was the sanctuary going to burn down, along with our hard-won peace? But then I saw him stop. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't shutting me out. He was terrified of losing everything we had built. He reached out and grabbed my hand, his grip crushing. "I'm sorry, Elena. I'm scared. But we're going to get them out. Together." We spent 3 days in a makeshift shelter at the fairgrounds, surrounded by terrified animals and exhausted volunteers. It was a brutal test of our physical and emotional endurance. We slept on cots, ate cold sandwiches, and worked around the clock to keep the animals calm. But in the midst of the crisis, we found a new level of connection. We didn't need words to know what the other person was thinking. We moved in a synchronized rhythm, anticipating each other's needs before they were even spoken. The fire was a literal and metaphorical trial by fire, and we were coming out of it stronger. When the word finally came that the fire was contained and our property was safe, we collapsed into each other's arms, weeping with relief. The sanctuary had survived, but more importantly, we had survived as a couple. We had faced the ultimate threat and hadn't let it break us. When we finally returned home, the smell of smoke was everywhere, but the garden of wildflowers was still standing. We spent the next week cleaning up the ash, our hands working together in the dirt once again. The fire changed us in ways we didn't expect. It made us realize how fragile everything was, and it deepened our commitment to the sanctuary and to each other. We started taking more time for ourselves, leaving the daily operations to our trusted staff once a week, so we could just be Elena and Radin. We went on long hikes, talked for hours about nothing in particular, and rediscovered the simple joy of each other's company. The high-stakes nature of our life became a source of strength rather than a source of stress. One evening, while we were sitting on the porch watching a litter of rescue kittens play in the grass, Radin turned to me. "I was so afraid I'd lost you during the fire," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I realized that the sanctuary is just buildings and animals. You are the real heart of my life." I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling a sense of peace that was deeper and more solid than anything I had ever known. We had survived the silence, the mud, and the fire. As Hope grew older, her body began to slow down. The old injury to her leg started to cause her significant pain, and we knew the day was coming when we would have to say goodbye. It was a long, slow farewell. We spent every possible moment with her, bringing her special treats and grooming her velvet coat until it shone. She remained the centerpiece of our life, a living reminder of the miracle that had saved us. One afternoon, as she was lying in her favorite sunny spot in the paddock, she looked up at us with those big, dark eyes, and I knew it was time. Radin held her head in his lap, whispering his thanks into her ears, while I stroked her mane. She went peacefully, surrounded by the people who loved her most. The loss was devastating, a hollow ache that felt like it would never go away. But even in our grief, we weren't alone. We had each other, and we had the legacy she had left behind. The sanctuary felt impossibly empty without Hope's presence. Every corner of the property was a reminder of her, the paddock where she took her first steps, the stable where we spent those long nights, the garden where she loved to graze. But we realized that her spirit was alive in every animal we saved, in every child who found healing in our barns, and in every moment of honesty we shared. We decided to build a small memorial garden in her honor, a place of reflection and peace for everyone who visited. Radin designed a beautiful, minimalist structure that captured the light in a way that felt like hope. Working on the memorial together was a way to process our grief and celebrate her life. We talked about the night we found her, the way she had looked in the mud, and the way she had looked the day she died. We realized that her life had been a masterpiece of survival, and our marriage was the frame that held it. The sanctuary continued to flourish, becoming a model for similar organizations around the country. We traveled together, sharing our story and helping others build their own bridges to a better life. Our marriage became a source of inspiration for people who felt trapped in their own cold, silent lives. We were honest about the struggles, the fights, and the hard work it took to stay connected. We told them that love isn't a fairy tale, it's a commitment to stay in the mud together. One evening, at a fundraising gala for the sanctuary, I looked at Radin across the room. He was talking to a group of young architects, his face animated and full of passion. He wasn't the cold, distant man I had married. He was a leader, a partner, and a friend. He caught my eye and smiled, a look of such pure, uncomplicated love that it took my breath away. I realized then that the silence was gone forever. We are older now, and the daily work of the sanctuary is mostly handled by a new generation of dedicated rescuers. But we still go out to the barns every morning, greeting the animals and checking on the new arrivals. The house is no longer a pristine mansion. It's a warm, cluttered home filled with the memories of a life well lived. We have a family now, not just our foster daughter, who is now a successful veterinarian, but the hundreds of animals and people whose lives we've touched. Our relationship is like an old, sturdy oak tree. It's been through storms and fires, but its roots are deep and its branches are wide. We don't need a lot of words to understand each other anymore. A look, a touch, a shared silence is enough. We know that we are lucky to have found our way out of that hole. Tonight, the air is cool and smells of the coming rain. I'm sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies dance over the wildflower garden. Radin is sitting next to me, his hand resting on mine. We aren't talking, but the silence between us is full of everything we've been through. It's a silence of peace, of gratitude, and of love. I think about that first night, the darkness of the trench, and the terrifying cry for help. I realized that the most important thing we ever rescued wasn't just a pony, it was the ability to hope. We saved each other, one handful of mud at a time. And as the first drops of rain start to fall, I lean into my husband, knowing that no matter what comes next, we are ready. We are home. The rain started to fall harder, drumming a rhythmic pattern on the porch roof. It reminded me of that first night, but now the sound was soothing instead of terrifying. Radin squeezed my hand, a gesture of quiet solidarity. I was thinking about the new expansion for the avian wing, he said softly, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the garden lights. I smiled, knowing his mind was always building, always improving. We spent the next hour talking about bird sanctuaries and flight cages, the conversation flowing easily between us. There were no hidden agendas, no sharp edges, just two people sharing a vision. I realized that our problems had never really been about the work or the house. They had been about a lack of purpose. Now that we had a shared mission, everything else fell into place. The challenges were still there, but they were no longer threats to our relationship. They were opportunities to grow. I looked at the scars on my hands, faint lines from ropes and fences, marks of a life spent in the dirt. I used to be so ashamed of them, wearing expensive gloves to hide the evidence of my unladylike hobbies. Now I see them as badges of honor. They're the physical record of the work we've done to save ourselves. Radin has his own scars too, burns from the fire, calluses from the hammer. We're a map of our own survival. I realized that the perfect life we had been trying to project was a lie that was killing us. The real beauty was in the imperfections, the repairs, and the honesty of the struggle. We had traded a hollow perfection for a gritty, vibrant reality, and it was the best trade we ever made. Our daughter called us later that night, excited about a surgery she had just performed on a rescue dog. Hearing the passion in her voice made me realize that the healing we started with hope was continuing through her. The next morning, the sanctuary was a hive of activity. A group of school children was arriving for a tour, and the air was filled with their excited chatter. I watched Radin lead them through the barns, his voice patient and engaging as he explained the stories of each animal. He told them about hope, about the hole in the ground, and about the importance of never giving up on someone just because they're broken. The kids were mesmerized, their eyes wide with wonder. I realized that we weren't just saving animals, we were teaching the next generation how to be compassionate. We were building a legacy of empathy that would outlast any skyscraper Radin could have ever designed. It was a humbling thought. We were just two people who got lucky enough to find a reason to change, and now that reason was changing the world around us. As the sun began to set on another busy day, I found myself back at the memorial garden. The wildflowers were in full bloom, a sea of color against the darkening sky. I sat on the bench Radin had built and watched a butterfly land on the plaque. I felt a sense of profound peace. We had been through so much, the silence, the mud, the fire, the grief, and yet, here we were. We had survived it all because we had learned how to hold on to each other. I realized that love isn't something you find, it's something you build, one day at a time, with patience and hard work. It's the decision to stay when every instinct tells you to run. It's the courage to be honest when you're terrified of being judged. It's the willingness to get your hands dirty for the sake of something bigger than yourself. Radin came out and joined me on the bench, his presence a warm, steady comfort. He didn't say anything, just put his arm around me and watched the sunset. We stayed there for a long time, the silence between us full of the memories of a life that was finally whole. I looked at the man beside me, the man who had been my stranger, my enemy, and now my greatest ally. I realized that the happily ever after isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new one, every single day. We are the architects of our own happiness, and we have built something that will stand for a lifetime. As the stars started to appear, I knew that the darkness would never again be a threat. We had found our light, and it was each other. We are home, and we are whole, and we are finally, truly, perfectly happy.